Welcome to Violet Rage, Voices for Change and Revolution. I'm Dr. Matt R. Salmon, a psychiatrist, advocate, and disruptor, here to explore the stories and systems that shape our lives. Each week, we'll challenge the status quo, amplify diverse perspectives, and envision a more inclusive, equitable world. Whether we're diving into personal truths or dismantling systemic failures, this is your space for rage, resilience, and transformation. Let's ignite the revolution. Today on Violet Rage, we're diving into a conversation that's urgent, frustrating, and all too familiar: the rise of anti-queer legislation in the US. These attacks on LGBTQIA+ rights aren't new, and they're not happening in isolation. They're part of a larger pattern, a cycle of backlash that follows every step forward in the fight for equality. But why does this keep happening? And what's really driving it? To help break it all down, I'm joined by Dr. Xander Mach. Dr. Xander Mach is a doctor of clinical psychology specializing in LGBTQIA+ affirming care. He provides mental health services to individuals in the queer community and has trained hundreds of healthcare and mental health professionals on inclusive, evidence-based practices and policies. As a mental health consultant, he led initiatives at large statewide mental health agencies focused on addressing outcome disparities for LGBTQIA+ patients, improving inclusive health record systems, and revising institutional policies and practices to incorporate queer affirming approaches. He also designed and delivered training on LGBTQIA+ identity and gender affirming care and contributed to the development of gender affirming services. Now based in Australia, Dr. Mach continues to advocate for health policies that promote accessibility and inclusivity for LGBTQIA+ individuals in the United States. Together, we'll explore why anti-queer legislation keeps resurfacing and how it's linked to broader patterns of oppression, how economic instability, fear, and media manipulation fuel discrimination, the mental and physical toll these policies take on queer individuals and marginalized communities, how allies, advocates, and healthcare professionals can push back against the harm. This isn't just about queer rights. It's about who holds power and how they use it to maintain control. Let's rage. Welcome back to the Violet Rage. This is Dr. Matt Salmon, and I am here with Dr. Alexander Mach, who is a dear friend of mine and has a lot of great knowledge, especially as it relates to the impact of anti-queer legislation and anti-queer sentiment here, especially in the US, and how that stance and the impact that can have on queer people. Appreciate having you here today. It is okay if I call you Xander.
Yeah. I think when people call me Xander, I'm like, oh, you're either my dad or I'm in trouble. And I can confirm that you're not my dad, so I'm just going to assume I'm in trouble.
Then we'll go ahead with that. So I guess to start, is there anything that you'd like to say before we get into some of the questions that I've got prepared?
I just want to thank you for having me on. This is something I'm really passionate about. It's something I've dedicated my career to doing and discussing and teaching other professionals about, particularly in the health and mental health fields. So I really appreciate getting the opportunity to talk about that with you.
I'm so glad to have you. You've always been somebody that I go to for advice on these kinds of things. So I'm excited to get deeper into a lot of the stuff. To start, tell me, what do you see as the driving forces behind the current wave of anti-queer legislation and rhetoric?
I think it's such a complicated question. I think there are so many variables and dynamics really driving the current wave of anti-queer legislation and really anti-other legislation more broadly that we're seeing right now. We're seeing cyclical historical dynamics play out, cultural structures, socioeconomic pressures, and issues with how information atmosphere has changed with the advancement of technology. First, I do want to point out that throughout the history of the US, we do have these moments of progress for marginalized people that are typically followed by some sharp backlash. That was evidence after the abolition of slavery with the introduction of Jim Crow segregation. We saw moral panic and white flight dynamics following desegregation and the passage of key civil rights legislation. In the 60s, there was a counter-feminist movement following progress in women's rights between the 60s and 70s. We do see this very cyclical tension between progress on one hand and regression on the other that does feel so familiar to our national history. And it's really incredibly frustrating if you're one of the people that is impacted by that tension. Importantly, when I consider the social psychology of this phenomenon, it's really not hard to see historically and currently that it's related to some group anxiety among people that have typically had a higher status. Cisgender, heterosexual white people predominantly see progress and access to power for people of other demographics, queer people, people of color, and also the working poor and working class people. It means a loss of power and status for them. A really prime example is this mainstream adoption of previously fringe positions. Things like adoption of the great replacement theory ideology at specific news and entertainment shows, right? It's all about the master status folks being replaced by people that have historically had less status.
Mhm.
Secondly, and this is how culture, history, psychology intersect, we do see these big swings toward conservatism, moral panic, and really intense in-group adherence and suspicion about groups, following catastrophes and periods of economic struggle. So just a little background, my dissertation research was specifically on the COVID pandemic before we get anybody accusing me of causing the pandemic.
It was DEI, actually.
Then living through the COVID pandemic and saw how absolutely bonkers it made everybody. I was like, this is really important to study. I was particularly interested in how white people specifically structured their decision making around what safety precautions to use and why they maybe didn't choose to use certain ones too. And so, in order to structure that research, you have to do this whole literature review, which involves gathering a lot of evidence from previous studies, similar events, those kinds of things. And the closest approximation is the flu of 1918. So I really dug into this to understand what is happening with why are they actively choosing some of these things? Why are they adopting some of these kind of wild belief systems? The interesting thing is that we do in that history find a lot of the same conspiracies existed, a lot of these same suspicions of racial and ethnic groups as causes or spreaders of illness. We see economic frustrations driving a desire to get back to normal, no matter the cost. We even saw people debating, should we put the kids back in school because we don't want them to miss out, right? All of these things that we heard almost existed verbatim back in the day. So we don't change. But connecting that to now, we have these two particular things, suspicions of people with differences, and then the economic frustration. I think both of those things are at play here in a lot of the anti-woke legislation. Our brains, they're trying to figure out what's happening and are primed to, when we're under threat, attack a lot more to people that are similar to us and detach from people that are less similar to us. It's this quick thing that our brain does. We don't think about it very deeply. And so people really fell into the rabbit hole. So they're starting to really tightly adhere to groups with similar identities and view groups with less similar identities with a lot more suspicion than usual. So then you throw on economic hardship, right? When we're struggling financially, we feel stress all the time. It's really hard to navigate the world, right? We need money to live. So we take away a lot of the ability for people to survive financially. We're stressed out. That reduces our brain's capacity to see the world in shades of gray, to really understand what's happening. So we make these quick, irrational decisions, including, from COVID, right? A lot of East Asian people were the targets of racism simply because that's where we thought COVID originated. I don't think we can confidently say that's where it originated, but that's the claim. A lot of East Asian people took the flak due to this process, both the neurocognitive process and the social psychological process. The other thing is, if I'm under economic hardship, I'm under threat, and we feel like the government who's supposed to protect us isn't doing enough, we're going to get pissed, right? And when we're really mad, we don't find it helpful to be mad at structures. We don't find it helpful to be mad at broader societal things because they're pretty amorphous. It's hard to really identify any one person or thing. And so we direct our anger at somebody.
The immigrant taking your job.
Yeah, exactly. And that's because if we think about the function of anger as an emotion, anger says, I have a conflict and it needs resolution. And how do we resolve conflict with this really giant amorphous thing? Can't really. It's just not something we can do. And so we pick and choose people that we might be able to resolve that conflict with and direct our anger at them. That's where scapegoating becomes really easy. Honestly, right? And this dovetails into information atmospheres. Companies created social media that rewarded engaging on a very emotional level. So going into the pandemic where everyone's stressed, everyone's angry, everyone's suspicious, you have these engines that are really feeding that cycle. I'm angry, I'm suspicious. I'm going to post about it online. Then the algorithms behind engagement are going to put those in front of people's faces. People are going to interact with them. And so you have this technological and social feedback loop where you get maybe 50 likes on a post where you're angry and suspicious at somebody because of what's going on, but 10 likes on a post like, hey, I'm really happy today. Or, hey, here's this innocuous thing that I found cool. And so it starts to really prime your brain to think like, oh, if so many more people are interacting with this, it must be true on some level. The technology is really distorted, and companies have really come and swooped in and capitalized on this vulnerability we have just as human beings. So that's where big picture stuff is coming.
It's so interesting because all of that was set up by these technocrats who are now part of the oligarchy ruling the United States.
Yeah, and it's so frustrating. I really wish people could take a step back and look at what's happening, right? If you look at their wealth from pre-COVID to now, it's like they've gone up 10 times in some cases from like a few $1 billion, like $200 billion. I think that's more than 10 times, but kind of shocking how much wealth they've amassed. And then you compare it to the amount of wealth lost by the nation, it's almost a 1-to-1.
Yeah, something you were saying also about the backlash that we see after social progress movements. It always reminds me of when you are trying to parent an explosive child and you're trying to set boundaries with them, and it's that extinction burst that you see before everything gets so much worse. They lash out before things start to actually shift again towards more progress and peace.
I hope that's the direction. We'll see.
Or yeah, maybe that's the hopeful part of me that's like, maybe that's what's happening. But how do you see these policies and debates impacting not only queer people, but society as a whole?
Yeah. Are you familiar with the concept of the canary in the coal mine?
Yes.
I'll explain it for folks that might not be familiar. Back in the day when people were mining and we had less technology to understand the conditions down in mines, miners used to bring canaries or other birds into the mine because these birds are more susceptible to environmental changes that might eventually be harmful to humans. So they bring them down in the mines, and as soon as the bird keels over, they're like, oh, it's time for us to get out. So when we use it as a metaphor, we're talking about vulnerable people are going to be the most immediately impacted by things. However, they're going to be broadly impactful down the road. So the immediate targets of these debates and policies are people at the moment, although there is some conversation about disability, race, ethnicity, indigeneity. They're going to be the most dramatically impacted because they're the targets of that change. But eventually, people down the line, they're also going to be impacted too if the government can just unilaterally decide what kinds of care a patient can receive based on some moralistic position and not really based on any preponderance of recent scientific or practical evidence. Access to life-saving care of all sorts can be taken away pretty rapidly. We see this happening with trans-affirming care. We see it happening with abortion and abortion-related care. It's a slippery slope, in my opinion. I can't remember if it's Florida or Texas that had enacted a ban on gender-affirming care. One of the chilling effects of that is doctors started to be worried about prescribing any kind of hormones or puberty blockers to anybody for any reason. There's a specific case where somebody was denied access to hormones for a medical disorder, specifically because the doctor didn't want to have their records audited and challenged or brought before a court because they were providing hormones that we might typically associate with this gender affirming care.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one way it can happen. Access to medical procedures, not just for trans people, but for all people can be impacted. I think there's also something to be said that a lot of the arguments that we're seeing about trans people, about queer people generally, are rooted in these very narrow stereotypes of sex. So there's this idea that female people should look and act this very specific way. Male people should look and act this also very specific but different way. And that there shouldn't be a lot of intersection of those two things. As a result, anybody who doesn't conform to this nearly defined stereotype suddenly comes under suspicion and can become targets of that same policy and debate, even if they actually originally supported that policy and legislation before.
Yeah. I think about women with PCOS or polycystic ovarian syndrome.
Yeah. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons that gender women might produce more testosterone than normal. Maybe they find themselves in competitive sports a lot. And so their testosterone levels are just naturally higher because when you're in competitions, often your testosterone is just higher than normal.
Increased muscle mass.
That it changes your build. But we have these stereotypes that then if somebody sees you, they're like, that is a man in a dress. Right. And we're seeing that play out a lot. Really. It sounds when we say it, but it really does play out. And so I do want to highlight then women and girls in particular tend to be the most impacted because a lot of this is deeply rooted in misogyny. Also, I do want to highlight transvestigation because I'm talking around it. Are you familiar with what transvestigation is?
No, I haven't heard that term before.
There's this whole movement on the internet called transvestigation, and people that do it are essentially looking at physical features, behavioral cues of other people online, of politicians, of actors to investigate whether or not they're trans. The problem with this is looking at somebody's features is not a great way to figure out if somebody's trans or not, if they're cis or not. Those features that we've ascribed to cisgenderness are rooted in a very specific and narrow set of stereotypes that don't apply to a lot of people.
And they're not cross-cultural.
No, not at all. In fact, you jumped the gun. I was going to talk about how women of color, and particularly Black women, tend to be targets of transvestigation a lot more disproportionately. I think we saw that with Michelle Obama, right? That's a really high-profile case where both of Barack Obama's presidential terms on Fox News, they spent time trying to determine whether or not this woman, this cisgender woman, was actually trans or not. And on the internet, people would call her, quote, a man in a dress. And so that can happen to all sorts of women and girls. The way these policies play out, though, Utah in 2022 passed this law that made it illegal for trans girls to participate in youth sports. And if you think about the enforcement mechanism of that, like how do you figure out if somebody's trans?
Especially a kid.
Yeah. And for people that don't know, when you are young, you can look pretty ambiguous. It can be hard to tell somebody's sex just from looking at them when they're young. That's just normal. As a result of that ban, you had this high school girl who was good at her sport, won, and some parents reported her to the state athletic board of being trans without telling this girl's parents. The state athletic board went through all of her records dating back to kindergarten. Shocking, right? Imagine being a parent and finding out about that after the fact. Alarming. I wouldn't be comfortable as a parent knowing that somebody could just do that on a whim. Somebody could report my child for winning. But that's the point, right? The point is I'm going to enforce these stereotypes on other people, and then I'm going to weaponize them too. Say, if I don't agree with you, I can use this to silence you. And so that's just everyday ways that can play out. It can be wielded as a weapon against you if you don't fit in. If you're a cis heterosexual person, it can impact the kind of healthcare you can receive. And literally anyone can be brought under suspicion.
Man, I remember back when I was in high school track on the JV team, they would have us start and run with the girls varsity track team. I just remember one time one of the girls on the team literally lapped all of the boys and beat us all. I mean, for me, I'm like, that's awesome. Good for you. Everybody was pretty amazed. I don't remember anybody having a negative thought about it. Like, it's so funny how all of that stuff is just
And I think
driven by parents.
Yeah, back in our day, she would have just been considered like a really phenomenal athlete. Although I'm sure we would have called her a slur. These dynamics have changed a lot. I think they end up being slightly and uncreatively reimagined.
Well, thinking historically, do you draw any parallels between this and other historical forms of oppression with what we're seeing today in the backlash against LGBTQ rights?
Yeah, I want to point out that a lot of these debates, this moral panic about queer people has existed in our history. It comes and goes in waves. Starting in the 40s and 50s, we saw the Red Scare wrapped up with anti-queer sentiment. We also saw the Lavender Scare, right? There's this concept back in the day, and now that queer people are somehow morally deficient or they're easily manipulated by foreign actors because they have this secret about them that's actually criminal. If they're working in government, suddenly they're susceptible, or they kind of create this vulnerability for our national security. National security is this trick that's often played to marginalize people. We also see it in the 80s and 90s with HIV and AIDS policy and stigma. Right, the government literally refused to act on approving HIV medications because Ronald Reagan thought it was an appropriate punishment for being gay. So did a lot of other political actors. We saw it in the 2000s with the Defense of Marriage Act, and George W. Bush, one of the core features of his presidential campaign was getting a constitutional amendment on the books defining marriage as between one man and one woman. And really, it takes on different iterations and who or what it targets and how it does that. But the messaging almost is identical, right? They're coming for your kids. They're ruining the fabric of society. And when I say society, I mean Christian society. It's unhealthy. It's mental illness. And then usually there's also this argument that accepting queer people is a slippery slope to some other bizarre outcome. So the one that I can remember from being a kid is if we allow gay people to get married, what's next? A man marrying a dog? I don't know if you remember that one, but that one sticks out in my brain so readily.
I hope the dog gets a prenup,
I really wish people would take 2 seconds to be like, does this sound really crazy coming out of my mouth? And then choose whether or not they're going to say it based on it. But like, as far as other historical forms of oppression, misogyny and strict adherence to stereotypes, gender roles are the through line between all flavors of queerphobe. For example, cis hetero men dislike gay men because that's really not what men are supposed to do. Being with another man, especially in a sexually receptive or submissive role, is considered effeminate, and it's a threat to stereotyped masculinity. Similarly, anti-trans sentiment, if you think about the public debate, it's almost exclusively about trans women. The tension is that if you're born male, you need to act this way. If you're born female, act this way. If you're born female, you need to act and look this way. And so suddenly, when people are not acting and looking in ways that are aligned with their sex assigned at birth, it's this major transgression because it doesn't fit into a stereotype.
Yeah, it makes me think also about a lot of gay men who identify with that hypermasculine idea or presentation. And we see a lot of bigorexia in the community, ultimately developing these bodies that straight men never even had and becoming more muscular and masculine presenting than even a lot of straight men.
Almost like a caricature of masculinity, right? If I feel like I'm pushed out of masculinity as a gay, I'm not saying this about me, just ideologically, right? I think sometimes gay and queer men can feel like they're pushed out of masculinity. And so in order to regain that sense of masculinity, it feels sometimes like there's this, and I don't mean this in a judgmental way, like it's almost like over correction. I'm going to show you how masculine I am, like visually.
It's so interesting. Well, Shifting gears, thinking more on the individual and greater social, but what would you see as tangible mental health and social consequences of this kind of backlash on queer people?
Yeah, I think there are many, and I don't think they're isolated to queer people. I want to talk about the research first,
Mhm.
like the impacts on research and how that trickles down to the rest of society. Then I'll talk about the very specific impacts you see in queer people. I'm sure you're familiar with the executive order about trans affirming care that came out. Essentially, what it does is declare WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, and their guidelines and any of the supporting research they use to establish those guidelines for care as junk science. Here's the problem. That is science that was done over years and decades. It's like the greatest and best consolidation of the science available and like
Yeah.
practical experience available. And now it's just been characterized as all junk science based on no review of the evidence, based on a moralistic position. And what happens now then, if we as providers accept that premise that it's all junk science, simply because the government said it was junk science, we have to now adopt an anti-science position, or we lose our ability to treat people, right? We no longer get public funding. You probably run into this problem like I would have when I was working in community mental health. You're reliant on Medicaid and Medicare funding when you work for a public serving clinic. If you lose access to that, you can no longer operate for anybody.
Yep.
So
We got
you're
our cease and desist order last week.
Yeah, right. And now there's a tension between your ethical obligations and the law, right? My ethical obligation is I'm not supposed to do any harm. I'm supposed to treat people with humility and embrace who they are. I'm supposed to inform my practice with science. And so they're saying, actually, we don't think the best science is what you should inform your practice by.
Bible is your science now.
Yeah, basically, now providers and researchers in this situation, they're like, what do I do? There's this crisis.
Yeah.
So for other people who don't know, the reason that we inform our practice with science is so we can legitimize it, right? So that we can say the thing that we're doing is actually doing what it's supposed to do.
Mhm.
And so if you take that away, suddenly people can do all sorts of stuff. They can essentially make you a human experiment for whatever kind of care they want to do to you. And you don't have a lot of recourse because they took the science base away.
I don't have to follow science, so
I don't
whatever.
have to follow what science says is best for you. I can just do whatever I want.
Mm.
No person should want that. It makes me think of the intention behind the movement like conversion therapy. To me, it kind of reeks of let's try to bring conversion therapy back.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that is essentially what's happening to trans youth. It's
Yeah.
just more on a physical level, and like a hormonal chemical level. We're going to essentially castrate you, like for trans boys. And again, let's just tell young women what they can do with their bodies, you know?
Yeah, and that is a slippery slope because if we as providers have to accept an anti-science position simply because the government has a moralistic opinion about it, they can just declare anything they don't like as junk science. And suddenly we get this curtailing of all sorts of care that people can receive. It doesn't necessarily have to stop at queer people. That can
Yeah.
create situations like race science and all these other things that we've seen in our history, eugenics,
Yeah.
that really belong in modern care, but used to be seen as perfectly okay and legal.
Yeah. Unfortunately, history has proven associations like the American Psychiatric Association just fall in line with what the government wants and will honor junk science, you know?
It's really unfortunate. I mean, both the APA and the American Psychological Association, we do have really sordid histories and how we've historically mistreated and misunderstood people. And the government is saying, actually, you should continue to do that.
Yeah. Well, so how do these laws affect the sense of safety and belonging for queer youth specifically?
Yeah. So I also realized I didn't fully answer that last question. I said I was going to come back to it and I never did. I'm going to roll it all together. There has been all sorts of research on these kinds of debates, policies, and the consequences they have on people. In one such study published last year in 2024, the mental health outcomes of two groups were compared. one group of young trans and non-binary people who lived in states that had enacted anti-trans laws, and one group lived in states without anti-trans laws. They followed these people for 2 years, and it was just under 100,000 participants. Massive study. And if you think about statistical power, that is phenomenal. I'm going to value a research study like that. Plus, it compares two different groups simultaneously. There's so many good things about that kind of research. What they found is that those young people who lived in states with anti-trans policies experienced a significant increase in suicidality and suicide attempts during the first year following initiation of those policies.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on where it was and what the policy was and what age demographic you narrowed the band to, is anywhere as low as 7% increase and as high as 74% increase. Massive, right? So literally pushing trans youth to suicide. And then the second year following the passage of those laws, we see a significant increase in suicidality and suicide attempts across the entire nation. I think it's about feeling so pushed out by society that I feel no way out except to kill myself. In a particular study, they only looked at trans and non-binary youth. So living in a state that has protective laws for you as a queer person might protect your mental health and well-being a little bit, but eventually it catches up with you, even if it's in another state.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, because they're seeing their community members being pushed out and mistreated, and ultimately that sends a message to them that, you're the same as them.
Yeah. And as far as care systems, I think one of the other things that might happen is you get people in those states that move into states that have more protective laws in an attempt to access treatment to affirm who they are. Then what you get is this overloading of these systems that were never intended to treat 3, 4, 5 states worth of people.
Mm-hmm.
And they're struggling to treat one state worth of people.
That's what we're dealing with.
Yeah. So when I was living in Denver, this was a really big issue because people were coming from Texas, Kansas, Montana, Wyoming to get gender affirming care because that was codified into law in Colorado. The problem was there was only a handful of providers. And so you saw this massive jump in wait times from like 3 to 6 months go past 2 years in order to get care. So you have these people languishing on wait lists now simply because other states have enacted laws that curb people's access to care. And you see that across the spectrum, right? You see that with abortion care, maternal care, and even because that's intimately connected with abortion care. I think we also know that people that are targeted by stigma and stigmatizing policies, they're less likely to visit health and mental health professionals until it's an emergency, right? Until they really have to. And even then, they approach it with a lot of trepidation. They're less likely to obtain regular sexual health testing, potentially increasing risk for acquisition and transmission of STIs. Like they're more likely to experience all sorts of negative health and mental health outcomes. That kind of stigma actually increases cardiovascular risk, substance use, depression, anxiety, suicide, rates of PTSD, and so much more. It also increases homelessness, risk of violent victimization. If you don't think because of who you are, the police or emergency professionals are going to treat you well, if you're getting attacked, you might just bear it, try to survive it, and move about your day. These things really do have tangible impacts. I forgot to mention too, like queer kids also who are in states that have bans or less affirming policies, or in schools that have less affirming policies, they have lower graduation rates. And they also have lower school attendance, which can increase risk of all sorts of other things too.
It makes me think, that kind of stigma, oppression, discrimination also leads to chronic inflammatory conditions or autoimmune conditions. Yeah. There's so many ways it wreaks havoc on the body.
Yeah, there's some really interesting research about loneliness and isolation and the effects it has on the body. Also increases early mortality. If you're an older person, having those kinds of policies that make you feel more isolated, right? And this research isn't about, are you actually isolated? Are you actually lonely? It's, do you have a felt sense of isolation and loneliness? And when it happens, right, you have these policies that make you feel that way, it increases your risk of dying before you're supposed to.
Yeah. I work with a lot of people who don't even really bother to think about the future because they don't think they have one.
100%. So I do want to take that and apply it psychologically to the question you're asking, like, how does this affect the sense of safety and belonging? Right? Who David Elkind was. My apologies to David Elkind if you're still alive and I'm talking about you in the past.
We hope you are.
I hope you are. I don't know anything about you. There's so much work you did. But if you are alive and I'm thinking about you like your dad, I totally apologize. He's a well-known psychologist.
It's because he left such a great legacy.
100%. He had this theory about adolescents that a lot of the ways they thought and acted were constructed around the idea that they're constantly being observed by an imaginary audience. And in fact, I think it's called the imaginary audience fallacy. It's this phenomenon, right? And to be perfectly honest, I think it might be somewhat true that we also start to be more self and socially aware around that time, but I'm not really sure if it ever fully resolves. So I think all of us can say if you fall on your ass in the street or whatever, there's this moment you're like, God, everyone saw that. And I look at that like such an idiot, right?
I always just laugh at myself just in case someone's watching so that they're like, oh, he's laughing. Okay, we're good.
And like your spine is split in two.
Yeah. So we're laughing with him. That's all. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So imagine you're going through this phase of life where you're really starting to think critically about how other people are observing you. A lot of the times we find that it's not necessarily an accurate assumption. In fact, if you really thought about it, most people don't notice you beyond a glance. They don't think about you after they see you. They don't think about you even if you fell on your ass in the middle of the street. They don't really give two shits because you're not an integral person in their life.
Yeah, that's because they're also thinking about everyone else watching them.
Yeah, you're going through that phase of life. And maybe now you've discovered that you're kind of different from your peers. That really adds to the sense of people scrutinizing you because of those differences, whether that's your sexuality, your gender, your expression, any of those things. But you're particularly maybe a little bit more vulnerable to that imaginary audience stress, is what I like to call it when I'm working with my youth. Now you throw in real hard evidence that not only are people scrutinizing your differences, they're scrutinizing them negatively and at like a state or national level. The people that you're hoping would protect you say, ooh, actually that person is more efficient, they're defective, whatever you want to say. And suddenly, because I'm so hyper aware of how people are observing me, that gives me evidence that's true and true in a very negative light. I might be pushed to do anything and everything to ameliorate that, including escape through suicide. So I do think if we really think about that whole process, the whole thing is going to really instill this constant state of stress, this constant negative self perception, this constant perception that other people are looking at me through this negativistic and even violent lens.
Yeah. I remember the kids commenting on the way I walked, the way I talked, the way I wrote, my handwriting, who I played with. I mean, I felt like I couldn't do anything without getting a comment about it. I always worried about every little thing. It felt like I couldn't do anything without it. And then you throw in being autistic and it's like, you can't say things that way. Like most of the time, I'm like, I don't even know what I said that wasn't so bad in the first place.
Well,
I can't even remember what it was. Yeah. It's like a moving target. Oh, man.
alienating experience.
Yeah. So what we're talking about is basically bullies and abusers, those that try to control us. I wonder, what role can allies and advocacy organizations play in combating the harm caused by these anti-queer policies?
Yeah, I think a massive role, right? One of the things is like we're people, community is massively important. Historically, a lot of these like mutual aid agencies, advocacy and support agencies have played such an integral role in ensuring that people that are targets of any anti-other policy get at least some access to the kinds of safety, care, support that they need. And social movements aren't just built by the people being oppressed by the status quo. They really require coalitions of people, including allies, to affect positive change. It wasn't Uncle Ben who originally said it, but he was right when he said, with great power comes great responsibility. And if you're an advocate, if you're somebody who has more status, more power, more resources, like your voice really does matter and your actions really do matter. I'd also offer a minor edit to that quote: with greater proximity to power comes great responsibility.
Privilege.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're somebody who isn't the target of these kinds of policies, who has more access, more proximity to power, you have a lot greater social and political control. And it's a really prime opportunity to levy that position in the world to combat the harm that might come from anti-queer policies or other policies. How you do that is so dependent on what your skill set is as a person, an agency, whatever, as a collective. So maybe you're a legal aid organization assisting people in navigating or challenging laws that are disproportionately impacting. Maybe it's organizing travel for care to states that still can protect gender affirming care. Maybe it includes organizing protests or labor strikes. I do want to highlight that even in authoritarian, autocratic societies, labor is one of the most important things, period.
Yeah, we made their wealth, so we can take it away.
100%. If you withhold your labor, what do? They suddenly lose wealth, power, etc., because you're the one getting their wealth, power, etc. Maybe it's as simple as you providing your queer friends, family, neighbors a safe, accepting, and welcoming companionship, right? So it doesn't have to be these like grand protests. It doesn't have to be anything massive. It can be as simple as like being there for the people that you love.
Mhm. Makes me think of that poem. I can't remember who it was by, but it's that poem about, they came for this population and I did nothing and they came for this one. And then there was no one left to come take care of me. I'm like, yeah, well, that's what we're seeing now, fortunately.
Yeah. That poem's really interesting because part of it, it does talk about how first they come from laborers, right? Because they know labor is where people, when they feel like they're being economically disadvantaged by people in power, they're going to come together and remove that economic advantage from the people that are disadvantaging. And so labor, like class solidarity, is the most powerful way to combat a lot of the stuff that's going on, right? This whole movement, it's not about any specific identity of person. It's really about fracturing the population so they can't come together and remove that access to power.
I think one of the troubles is when you're talking about classes coming together, I feel like so much of the middle class, for some reason, they delude themselves. Because I know in my family or even like other families that were middle class, they all were Republican because they saw themselves as like the wealthy that people were trying to take down. And it's like, please, sure, Jan, sit down. You're barely lower middle class anymore. We're not talking about you.
Right. Well, the interesting thing about that is I think folks in that economic position, because they don't feel like they're under immediate threat of dying by poverty, they're like, I'm doing well. And in fact, they're like one medical emergency away from losing their home.
Yeah. Yeah, and they're just living in chronic stress the entire time, despite being more comfortable than those in poverty.
Right.
Um,
Absolutely.
we see a lot of hypocrisy in all of this that's going on. How do you reconcile the carve outs in anti trans legislation that mandate surgeries for intersex children, even though other surgeries might be forbidden?
Yeah. So it's a really interesting thing. Oh, one of the wildest things to me up at this moment is that legislators often say something to the tune of, we're against the mutilation of children when they pass bans on medical affirming care for trans and non binary youth, but insist on putting specific carve outs into their laws that affords parents specifically the right to do those surgeries and hormonal treatments on intersex children and infants. For people listening at home, if you're not aware of what intersex means, I want to explain that. Intersex is a sex classification whereby somebody's anatomy, physiology and or genetics don't necessarily align with how we've historically defined the terms female or male. This can mean a person who's born with external or internal reproductive organs that aren't easily categorized as exclusively male or female. In history, we've seen that when intersex people are born, doctors often want their parents to choose to assign sex, either as male or female. Usually, a suggestion might be made by the doctor based on how easy it might be to do based on the anatomy they're seeing, which is kind of wild.
Yeah. This one, I feel like I could do a better job at this one. So, like, that's what your baby is now.
Yeah, surprise, it's a boy now.
Well, I know. It's just like when they look at white noise, the static on the ultrasound, and they're like, that's what it's going to be for the rest of its life. And this is what it can expect to make money-wise the rest of its life.
It's really wild to me. To me, there's this very large disconnect between saying, I don't support mutilation of children's genitals.
They did it to mine. I'm still mad. I didn't get to consent to that. If I could find that pediatrician.
Yeah, so it just feels disconnected from the stated belief system, from the stated value system, that you're against whole cloth the mutilation of genitals in children when we're doing circumcisions, we're doing intersex sex assignment surgeries. And like, side note, gender affirming surgeries are pretty much not performed on children at all. It's pretty rare that any gender affirming medical interventions are done before puberty. For the most part, it's just social affirmation. So letting somebody present, dress, and explore who they are based on their sense of their gender. And there's this ramping up of what care is necessary at like what stage and level of puberty. And surgeries are very rarely done before the age of 18. And it goes through this very, very rigorous review process in order to get to the point where a medical doctor, a mental health provider, the family, and the adolescent really are at a point where they're like, okay, we think this is the appropriate treatment and we're going to move forward with it. But it's a pretty rigorous process to get to the point.
It's usually multiple physicians because you have to have primary care on board, a psychiatrist, also a therapist on board. You have to have the surgeon on board. There's so much involved. It's wild to think that anyone could ever suggest that it's just done willy-nilly,
Like they're sending these kids to school and they're coming home with different genitals. Like, that's not happening at all. First of all, point to me a school that has a surgical theater anyway. And second of all, there's so many barriers to doing that in such a quick way. And it's not a quick surgery. It takes a lot of time to recover. It's pretty phenomenal that is part of the understanding.
Yeah, we can literally subject children to other surgeries. A parent could coerce their child to get a nose job without even seeing a psychiatrist, without a therapist, without a primary care consenting to that. Just if they find a surgeon to do it. If the parent bullies the child enough into thinking that their nose is something's wrong with it, then that child is going to get that surgery.
Yeah, I think that's a really appropriate comparison. It's pretty wild that we allow intersex surgeries on babies and children. The no-no here is even just medication for trans youth that we know is life-saving. And that's reversible. So just to come back to what we're talking about, it really is these carve-outs for doing gender affirming care and hormone treatments or gender assignment surgeries and hormone treatments on intersex infants and children, whereby parents are deciding on the anatomy and physiology of their child. These children cannot opt in or out of these surgeries. Their parents are doing it, they want them or not.
You cannot have gender affirming surgery unless it affirms the gender that I think you should be.
As your parent, you are this. Right. And so that really seems antithetical to the oft-used logic of being opposed to genital mutilation of children. It's exactly what they're banning for trans youth and banning it in bad faith because it's not really happening almost ever in trans youth. In fact, I think the most common gender affirming surgery performed on people under the age of 18 is chest reconstruction done for cisgender boys who have gynecomastia. I want to say it's over 5% of gender affirming surgeries are actually done on cisgender boys.
Those boys can't get gender affirming surgery anymore.
That is another detriment too. And that can cause a lot of distress and a lot of bullying for cisgender boys.
No. Sorry, buddy. You got boobs now. Wait till you're 18 and then we can get rid of them.
Yeah. I do want to add too, like with intersex sex designations, those surgeries are very frequently not medically necessary. So some of the ways that intersex bodies might present don't pose any medical risk. It's really just that they're antithetical to this very narrow stereotype of maleness and femaleness. I think it used to disquiet medical doctors more than it does now, but it still does because there are so many physicians that aren't necessarily aware of sex in this nuanced way.
Yeah, it's just unrealistic body ideals or body standards that fuck everyone up.
They don't really fit for a lot of people.
So what does this contradiction reveal about the true intent of anti-trans and anti-queer movements?
I think if we really distill the reason that carve out exists, it's pretty much because intersex sexes don't fit into the very binary world of sex and gender. That's the cornerstone of a lot of anti-queer sentiment. It's basically biology itself saying humans aren't binary on a genetic, physiologic, or anatomic level. And people are so uncomfortable with that because it's the natural world refuting their belief system. So rather than adjust their worldview, they'll allow for medically unnecessary surgeries and treatments on intersex children and infants so they can say, oh, look, actually, people are and should be very binary. These people were just defective in some way. If it works and if it's not a problem, why are we looking at it through the lens of pathology?
Mm-hmm. It makes me think about this conversation I was having about intersex individuals and the kind of genetic or chromosomal differences that there can be when it comes to intersex individuals. Historically, we've always considered males to be XY and females to be XX, but there are at least 6 common variations. I was trying to have this conversation about it, and the guy was like, well, but these are maybe square pegs, but we're just going to shove them here in this round hole and call them women. And we're going to take these ones and shove them in this hole and call them men. And it's like, that's not how that works. Like, they're different.
Yeah. I mean, the chromosomal differences themselves have such an interesting history. So when we had the technology to finally look at people's chromosomes, they started noticing when they started mapping people's chromosomal makeups, they started noticing that like, oh, actually some people that were men didn't necessarily have the chromosomes we would expect. And one of those configurations was XYY. Originally, they theorized that these people with XYY chromosomal makeups were super males and that they were prone to aggression. We might expect that they'd end up in prison. It's just so wild because now that we have a lot better understanding, a lot of that mythology that came about is not necessarily true.
Yeah, they must be because they got 2 of the Ys.
I remember when I learned that, I was like, that feels like an Onion article. It was an actual theory that was posited by medical professionals at the time.
Yeah, I feel like even when it relates to starting testosterone in trans males, so often they are also just fearing that they're going to have these aggressive mood changes when really, at least in my experience working with these individuals, they're actually quite stabilizing and end up much less irritable on these medications, less depressed, you know? So it's these kinds of problematic ideas. Just because you have testosterone now, you're this aggressive person and people should be afraid of you.
Well, I want to highlight what you're saying. I think that's so important, right? Because we know through both practical experience and years of research that when you introduce these medical affirming treatments to people who are seeking them, they understand the risks, they understand the benefits. Generally speaking, they see a very positive effect of that. One of the studies I'm familiar with saw a 70 to 74% decrease in suicidality among trans people who were put on puberty blockers or hormonal interventions. You don't see that kind of improvement with any psychiatric medication.
No. The only thing that works that well is amphetamine.
That's astounding that we're sitting here and saying this is an experimental drug. This is where we don't even know how it works long term, when in fact we do. And in fact, we know trans people are experiencing a lot of dysphoria, a lot of anxiety, depression, etc., because this incongruence they're experiencing, when you put them on that medication, it works so well, and it works better than any antidepressant you could put them on.
I wouldn't be surprised if Big Pharma is driving the end to gender affirming care. If people are getting healed by actually having the root cause of their problems dealt with, they're not going to be buying our medications.
I mean, I'm no expert on Big Pharma. Like, you weigh in on that. In my opinion, it's either people with this Christian nationalist lens are coming to the table in bad faith, or
always
they're aware of this evidence. People have put this evidence in front of them before. I have a really hard time believing it hasn't been put before them. And so they're coming to the table in bad faith, knowing that if we take this care away from people, it'll increase their risk of dying by suicide.
It's eugenics.
Yeah. Yeah. It's bleak to think like that, but there is a big part of me that thinks there's no way that they haven't been presented with this evidence before and they're charging forward regardless. And maybe it's like, okay, this is how I get reelected. Again, if that's the case, bad faith.
Yeah. But also, to what you're saying, like, better to send them home to their maker before they can sin.
Right. Exactly. People should be alarmed that politicians can decide what care you do and don't receive. They can decide what science is and isn't based on no understanding of the available evidence, and then take away life-saving care from people.
Yeah. We're seeing it across the board. There's such a mad dash right now for everybody to figure out how they're going to manage. We got to cease and desist, not even just for gender affirming care, but for anything diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is our entire mission. How do you provide equitable healthcare when you can't do equity?
I'm not a legal scholar or anything, but that feels like compelled speech, right? It feels like we're saying you should think and act as an organization, as a provider in this very narrow way that isn't even supported by actual evidence.
Yeah, well, I don't know that I've ever trusted the government to rely on science, to be honest. Thinking back to healthcare systems, how can they better address the mental and physical health disparities caused by societal discrimination or these kinds of situations that we're seeing with the change in policies?
I love this question because this is what I used to go into agencies and train people to do. Healthcare systems may not have a ton of control over the community outside of their system, but they can do quite a bit to mitigate discrimination within their own system. Engage in more community outreach and utilize feedback from stakeholders, patients, immediate community members physically around their system to guide service provision. Talk to the people in the communities where there are disparities and have them tell you what they might need. Right? Because I think so often the mistake healthcare systems, healthcare providers, et cetera, make is they make an assumption, sometimes an educated assumption. Like, I know this is common in communities like this from research, but then they try to force people into these care plans, treatment modalities, et cetera, that aren't necessarily guided by the actual people receiving them. So you kind of have to do a balancing act between those two things.
Mm-hmm.
Offer mobile services whenever possible, right? Being able to treat people where they are, where they're comfortable, can be massively life-changing for people for all sorts of reasons. Maybe they don't have the money, the time, et cetera, to get to the clinic. Maybe your clinic isn't accessible to them. Maybe you don't have ramps for people with mobility disabilities. Mm-hmm. Maybe you don't have the right equipment or the right translators to make sure that deaf people can receive services at your center.
That one's especially hard. I hear from a lot of my deaf clients that it's so hard for them to find in-person interpretation, which is often really hard to do it on a screen.
Because you might have some lag. What you're able to see can be different. And because when you do that kind of interpretation, your face is also really important, but it's not just your hands. Your facial expressions are important. So offer mobile services when possible. Seek to improve physical and virtual environments to ensure that they're welcoming and accessible to all people. This can include what language you put on your website, what kinds of images of people, et cetera, you use, who and what appears on your pamphlets, the availability of appropriate bathrooms for people of all genders and abilities, the language you use on your forms, and more. One of the shortcuts I often see in medical documentation is these check marks about people. So like, check if they're male or female, check if they're this gender or that gender, check this box for race or ethnicity. From a data analytics standpoint, I understand why you might do that. From a person-centered standpoint, it can be really exclusionary to people.
Yeah, just let them write it in.
Yeah, why not let them write it in? And then you might make a determination on the back end about like how well does this fit into some of the checkboxes we have, one, and do we have to expand the checkbox we have from a data analytics standpoint? Changing documentation and data collection practices to ensure respect for people's individual differences, allow for self-determination, and really better track outcome differences. One of the things I often see in providers in larger health agencies is that they might do an annual or biannual, usually it's a lot less than that, and usually it's just based on what the state requires, review of how are people doing in your system. But then they don't actually parse out the data and figure out like, okay, these kinds of people, when they come through our system, are either having less positive outcomes, less positive experiences, or they're coming to less appointments, or maybe they are doing that and then never interrogating why. So they're never going back to these stakeholders and saying, oh, hey, I've noticed you're missing a lot of appointments. I wonder why that is. To get that qualitative information to then be like, oh, you're missing appointments because when you come to the clinic, staff at the front are misgendering you every time. Or when you come to the clinic, you can't find a bathroom appropriate for your level of ability or your gender. Doing those things can help you put a finger on what tangible changes we can make to make sure that people feel like they can come back. So some EMR systems, EMR stands for electronic medical record, allow you to flag when you're giving certain medications and diagnoses. So there is a lot of bias in how we treat people and how we diagnose people. A good example is that Black people, when they come into clinics, are often misdiagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia because they come in with real fears about how the medical treatment has mistreated them or people like them that they know. You might be able to shed some light on this. They're often given some pretty heavy hitting antipsychotics as like the first line treatment, even though that might not necessarily be the best practice.
Yeah, that's pretty upsetting. Part of the trouble is blind spots or bias or just flat out their own internal racism. But even beyond that, a lot of providers don't show curiosity for what someone's saying. So if somebody says, because this is the word that they have for what they're experiencing, I'm paranoid, then the provider's like, nope, psychosis, paranoid delusions. And it's like, well, what do you mean by paranoid? And when you ask them, hypervigilance is really what they're talking about. And it's like, okay, well, that's a justified type of paranoia because you've been mistreated over and over again. So it's understandable that you're going to think certain systems and those in power are sus.
Yeah, it kind of dovetails into what I was going to say. Queer people are often misdiagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Part of borderline personality disorder is this feeling of a diffuse identity. I don't know who I am, but that is not unusual in queer people who have often been forced to explore who they are later in life. Some of the things that are within the realm of borderline personality diagnosis, we see in queer people because they are traumatized, because they are continually stigmatized. And so they might be suicidal. They might have an eating disorder because they're trying to change their body composition in a less effective way. And so we don't necessarily explore a lot of these things with curiosity. What I think might be helpful is having EMR systems actually flag these commonly misdiagnosed diagnoses and say, it's optimist in these kinds of people for these reasons. Are you sure? And then having to give a qualitative determination as to why you came to that conclusion as part of that process. It might take an extra 1 or 2 minutes to document that. That's all right if it avoids some negative outcomes for people. And similarly with those medications, hey, these medications are often overprescribed, and these people are underpaid. Sure. I think hiring and retaining staff at all levels that are more reflective of the communities being treated. There's a wealth of research that shows that people often feel more comfortable with medical and mental health providers that with shared identities and may experience better outcomes, particularly considering race, gender, ethnicity, and language when providers reflect their communities. I know this is so antithetical, but DEI is bad kind of thing. That's not to say exclusively hire people at all levels of agencies based on what they look like, based on their gender, based on all those other factors. Take the populations you're surveying into consideration when you are recruiting people to hire. And prioritize patient outcome measures over productivity measures.
That would be great.
I can tell you from like a provider sample, productivity measures seem so crazy to me, so wild. We have research on how they impact patient care, and the research doesn't say it impacts patient care positively. When your care provider is seeing too many patients in a day, they have less time to spend with you. They're more likely to make medical errors or some kind of other treatment error. You're less likely to have an improvement and less likely to come back because of it.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to therapy, I feel like it's less likely to be present, empathetic, and ultimately that destroys rapport. And rapport is the key factor in treatment working.
We also know when providers experience burnout in the systems they're providing care in, they're likely to leave those systems too. Then there's this calculus of, is this a benefit to me? And because providers with diverse backgrounds already have this feeling of obligation to their community, I think they experience burnout at much higher rates, especially because patients with similar identities often get funneled to them like, hey, you're a queer provider. I've got 80 million queer clients that you can see. I've got time for that, right? And so you're like, I love my community. I'm going to do the best I can. And then you're burnt out and you're like, well, fuck, I need to get out of here because I no longer feel like I can give adequate care to these people.
Yeah.
One of the last things is when outside referrals are necessary. The hope is you work in a system that can provide a lot of that wraparound care. But when they are necessary, consider who you're referring to and their practices and policies. A notable thing that can happen when queer people are referred to other providers is that they may not be referred to private providers that understand their needs, or they're referred to agencies that have explicitly discriminatory practices and policies. When I was working in Colorado, I think all of the homeless surveying agencies were affiliated with the Catholic Church. Because of that, they had explicitly discriminatory practices for people. We'd have providers that would refer them to these agencies. These people would go in and they would be mistreated. So they just walk out and live on the streets until they could get a housing voucher, which sometimes can take years. So if you're the provider or if you're the agency creating these referral networks, really do your homework and understand what does the referral environment look like and how do we improve our referral structure to make sure it attends to the needs that people. The last thing is healthcare systems are not apolitical. I think healthcare systems often see themselves through an apolitical lens and that we're just going to provide care to whoever we want or whoever we can within the bounds of the law. However, healthcare agencies are subject and suspect to political pressures. They should also flex their political power, right? For example, if you're the largest service provider in your state and you're just capitulating to pressure, you're essentially saying, great, we agree with these policies and we're just going to do it because that's the greatest amount of good for the most amount of people. It's one of those philosophers who I don't remember.
Uncle Ben.
Uncle Ben. Yeah, that utilitarian philosophy. And that's what they're doing. Saying, well, okay, we'll throw trans people under the bus to make sure that we can treat the most people. The problem is it's kind of this feedback loop. If the government says, okay, now we're going to throw another kind of person under the bus, are you going to capitulate? Yeah.
We just went back in the closet.
Yeah, right. And so healthcare systems can use their capital They can use their financial resources. They can use their political power. They can flex their status as a safety net hospital. And you're the only safety net hospital in a 200-mile radius. You can flex your political power with your state government at least and say, hey, look, if you don't push back on this policy, if you don't codify these protections into law for us as an agency, for our patients and for our providers, you're going to have a problem on your hands. That's another thing that agencies as a whole can do. And they can collectively do that together.
One of the things that I think of a lot when it comes to this, I've been thinking about it a lot since we got the cease and desist order and went back in the closet, like I said. When we look at research around queer youth and creating a safe space, or even just queer individuals across the board, one of the most protective things allies can do for them, or those in their like care circle, is to be an advocate and stand up to the powers that be that want to oppress them and put them down.
Yeah.
That's why it just feels so gross to have to react to this cease and desist order and react to what the government's doing. Because it's not just gender affirming care, it's all DEI. And it's like, what do you do when that's all you do?
Like, right. Well, and what message does it tell the people that are medically, psychiatrically vulnerable coming in to see you, who aren't cisgender, heterosexual, white, able-bodied people? What message does that say? The message is that we value our funding structures. We value our bottom line more than we value your outcomes.
Yeah.
That feels really unsafe, right?
A lot of people feel unsafe right now.
Why am I going to come to a medical clinic or a psychiatric clinic or a therapist who works for an agency that is saying treating people like you is negotiable to me?
Mm. Yeah. I know our vision, like our motto is, we see you from this peephole that we installed in this closet door we're hiding behind.
We see you, and that's it. Right?
Yeah.
I'm looking at you.
Yeah. I'm visualizing you right now.
I'm perceiving you. I'm observing you.
I hate it. Oh, man. Okay. Well, now it's been bleak. I hope you can give us some hope, but what gives you hope when facing what often feels like an uphill battle for equity and acceptance?
Yeah, it is so difficult to get in touch with a sense of hope right now when it feels like you're under threat from all angles, right? One of the things that give me hope right now are seeing how many people, friends, family, peers are banding together and moving towards doing something instead of just being consumed by dread, right? It's so easy to feel defeated when it feels like our communities are under attack from all sides. There are also so many people, at least in my world, that are fired up to push for better. I also find a lot of comfort in zooming out and taking a historical viewpoint. Queer people throughout human history have always existed. Every corner of the globe. And then I was like zooming out. It's round.
Yeah. It's like a flat earther calling it the globe.
Every corner of the flat earth. We see queer people existing throughout our history in pretty much every culture over time. And we've experienced really shitty things throughout our various histories throughout the world. We've also experienced a lot of great things, a lot of elevations, a lot of even like spiritual importance in various communities. When I think about that and all the things that we've overcome and all the ways that we have been loved and revered throughout our history, that kind of anchors me in a sense of hope too. It's like, it's going to fucking suck, right? It's going to feel awful a lot. And we have been through bad shit before and we have made it out on the other side. And just existing in a world that says you shouldn't exist is an act of resistance, right? That's an act that brings me hope and joy that I can exist in my body in a world that maybe doesn't necessarily want me to exist. And because I'm doing that, I might be bringing some hope and joy to other people that are having less hope and joy right now. I also think it is really important to, despite a lot of these things happening, not give in to that dread. Still go be with community. Still find joy in dancing and singing and laughing with your friends, right? Those are things that they can never take away from you. It is really important to not succumb to that dread and to still find joy in those things that once were joyful for you, because that too is an act of resistance. And that brings me hope.
Yeah. Keep living.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. For many of us, that is an act of rebellion because they don't want us to. So if we just keep living, that itself stands in the face of what they're hoping to gain.
Right. The cruelty is the point. Cruelty is the point. And I think people occupying that worldview think if they're cruel enough to you, you'll either disappear, hide yourself away, or die from whatever negative outcome that comes with that ostracization and isolation. Continue being with people that love you, care for you, accept you, that will laugh and dance and have joy with you.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you, Xander. Do you have any final thoughts for us? I feel like we've covered a lot, and now is probably a good time to start wrapping up, but want to know if there's anything else you'd like to say.
Yeah, I want to really thank you for having me on to talk about this. It's something I'm particularly passionate about, especially as a queer person and as a mental health professional. And so being able to talk about something like this is, I think, really important right now and really valuable. I think last thoughts are do what you can to find hope, whatever that means. It is okay to sometimes feel that dread. Don't mistake what I'm saying for just kind of push away a lot of the negativity. You can feel that negativity, but don't allow them to dictate what you do with your life. Don't allow them to take away the things that are going to keep you moving forward.
You've given me a lot to think about.
Thanks again for having me on.
Thank you. All right. We'll go ahead and wrap up here. Thanks for listening.
Bye now.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Violet Rage, Voices for Change and Revolution. If you're ready to challenge the status quo, share this episode and join the conversation. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts and connect on LinkedIn, Blue Sky, and TikTok to be part of the movement. Together, let's turn rage into action and build a better future. Until next time, stay resilient, stay bold.